Hi, my name is Abigail Crochet, and this is on instructional methods for energy production and consumption by the chloroplast and the mitochondria, both as individual organelles and as a subunit that performs complementary functions. Among the objectives for this presentation, we'll discuss effective methods of instruction specific to a target level of student audience, identify the key elements vital to understanding the mechanisms of production and consumption of energy in plants. This will be what specific information is key to building a broader understanding of the overarching topic. Distinguish relevant examples for student understanding on broader field scopes. This is where the topic can be connected to fields outside of classroom biology to make the content more relevant to them, a wider range of students. And discuss supplemental research and outside resources to complement instruction, not to replace or supplement instruction, but for the purpose of enhancing it. Objectives to be met through instruction. This is for basic understanding of the material, that being energy conversion and cycling processes through the chloroplasts and mitochondria. So, at the conclusion of instruction, students should be able to explain the role of energy production and consumption in plant metabolic function, identify processes of energy cycling in the chloroplast as an individual organelle, and then also in the mitochondria as an individual, and then discuss the relationship between the chloroplast and mitochondria in a plant's overall metabolic capabilities. So, on the importance of concept instruction, this is being framed with undergraduate students who are on non-STEM track majors in mind. So, that could be liberal arts students, business majors, engineering students. A major difficulty in instruction comes from finding ways to frame this content in ways that are applicable for these students coming from different disciplines of study. So, a major focus of instruction should be inspiring insight into broader concepts of mechanisms that fuel all life, broader concepts of cellular energy usage and production. From that, giving students the capabilities to draw connections to human metabolism. So, regardless of these specific mechanisms and processes that are being instructed on, being particular to plant systems, students can use these broader concepts to make connections to human health, human nutrition, the proper maintenance and working of their own bodies as a way to make this more universal material wise to this like wide variety of students. It should emphasize the importance of food as it turns to an energy source for cell function. And then from this, concepts of energy become essential to topics of nutrition, photosynthesis, as it'll be instructed throughout this presentation, the proper working of muscle movement, and the stability of ecosystems from like flows of energy. So that's kind of places where this concept can be made a bit more applicable to a wider range of students who are coming from different educational backgrounds and from varying disciplines of study who might be walking into a biology classroom potentially for the first time, or one of like a higher education level. So, as I said, these methods of instruction are geared toward undergraduate students who are not intending to pursue STEM majors. What comes as a result of this is that this specific material may really not be up these students' alley, or it might not align with their interests very well. So, because of that, a major part of instruction or organizing instruction has to be set aside for methods of boosting classroom engagement for these students so that they can find ways to interact with the material in a way that's a bit more relevant for them and that they'll be able to carry with them. So I believe that starts from emphasizing broad concepts over the minute details in a lot of cases. So some of those minute details, like the specific mechanisms and processes and things, might be essential for their in-classroom success, but over the long term, it's going to be those broad concepts over the function of life that they're able to take with them and make more applicable uses for in their everyday life. And then making personal connections for retention. This is where those connections to human mechanisms that I mentioned previously might be effective. That's kind of a universal interest, maintaining your nutrition, maintaining your energy levels, boosting your energy levels. So, understanding those concepts of cellular energy conversion and usage is transferable knowledge in some ways that can then be related back to broad concepts of human health. And college students can always use benefit from more strategies for boosting and maximizing their energy levels with the workload that they've got. So, integrating simulations and analogies is a utilization of dynamic and verbal model based reasoning. So, use of simulations within instruction is a visual comprehension of these interrelated mechanisms and temporal processes being played out in front of you that can supplement verbal lecture rather than just hearing things said to you, explained to you. And then the use of analogies is good for making connections of course materials to concepts that might be a bit more familiar or universal to these students. So, in the debate between handwriting and drawing versus typing in a classroom setting, numerous studies show that increases in neural connections can be made when something is written or drawn by hand, rather than when information is taken down by way of typing or if students are studying directly off of slideshows. So, for a lot of students, a more hands on instructional approach and more hands on interaction with the materials, such as writing or drawing diagrams, is a better strategy for their long term comprehension. And then active classroom use is always a benefit for comprehension rather than memorization. So if a student can take a more of a subset concept of a broader topic and they're able to fully explain and demonstrate those concepts for their peers through peer instruction, if they're able to teach their peers on these smaller concepts, that indicates a step beyond, like into a deeper comprehension. The use of error-based instructional tools comes from widespread studies that show that students from even varying countries, varying age levels, have tended to interchangeably use words such as food, nutrition, energy to kind of mean the same thing, when in biological terms, those words really don't refer to the same things at all. So this approach involves not teaching students errors, but on the conclusion of instruction, basically handing students errors to test their level of comprehension. So for example, handing a student a diagram showing the full cellular respiration cycle within the mitochondria that does have an error in it in some way. It could be a large error or it could be a series of small errors. If a student is able to look at this diagram, know that something is wrong with it, but also be able to explain what exactly is wrong with it and what can be done to make the diagram a more accurate representation of the cycle, this indicates a much deeper level of comprehension rather than just memorization. What's become increasingly understood and utilized in classroom environments is that visual-based learning is more effective for a majority of students for real-time comprehension than from reading or from listening to material. So that's where visual model-based reasoning becomes an essential instructional tool. In most biological educational cases, this takes the form of diagramming. So in this case, that could be taking a particle of a photon and kind of mapping its journey all the way through to an ATP molecule. That's kind of an example of what's shown on the right here in this image. A full diagram of these like mechanisms and processes into kind of one visual representation. A useful tool that can be used for this is something called checkpoint memory sketching. So this is kind of exactly what it sounds like. Having students at different intervals throughout the unit, whether it's weekly, by class, by different change of unit, sketching out these mechanisms, cycles, processes in diagram form, but completely from memory. So without the use of their notes, without the use of classroom materials, to kind of check if they're comprehending these topics, if they're retaining the information, if they're able to utilize new information to build on previous information and able to apply that in this way. Also, handing them diagrams and asking them to label things or add descriptions kind of shows you their comprehension of, what they're looking at. Are they able to tell you what they're looking at? Are they retaining that information? And then, kind of what was mentioned previously, there's increased neural activation that's widely been studied through the use of handwriting and drawing over things like typing. So, this is kind of a method that can be utilized in instruction to maintain longer term retention and comprehension. So, some critical information to consider when instructing on these topics of energy cycling and production within the chloroplast and mitochondria in plants are some of these background concepts, including the flow of energy. So, energy starting from the producer all the way to the consumer and how the consumer utilizes that energy, partially through energy partitioning. So, what is the consumer, where is this energy being allocated towards once it's produced? And this all kind of comes from that concept of that prior knowledge is crucial for solving tasks related to these flow diagrams. So when having students make diagrams, learn off of diagrams, do this visual learning, having this background knowledge can help them kind of understand these processes a bit better. Keeping in mind that these students may be non-STEM track majors, the importance should be on these main concepts and main ideas. So, in regard to the chloroplast as its own single organelle unit, the process of photosynthesis, being that light energy is converted to a glucose chemical fuel product, should be the main consideration there. And then for the mitochondria as a single unit, the process of cellular respiration being taking that glucose product, adding it to oxygen, consuming those products, and using that to convert to ATP as a final source of energy that's usable, a usable form to the plant, as what should be the consideration there. And then there should be an emphasis on the mitochondria being essential for making usable energy to the plant. So this all kind of culminates in that interconnectedness of the chloroplast and mitochondria. So more specifically, light as a form of energy is not very usable to the plant itself in its metabolic functions. So the chloroplast function is to use it to create glucose. Now, glucose also is not a sort of a usable form of energy for the plant itself, but it is compatible with the mitochondria as a product that it can use to create ATP, which is a usable form of energy. So these together are a little bit complementary, but also essential to each other to maintaining the plant's overall metabolic functions. What can be a useful example for emphasizing those broader concepts can be discussing the absence of either of these organelles to kind of emphasize the importance of each subunit to the whole. So emphasizing complementary regulation functions. In this case, it could be that without the chloroplast, the mitochondria has no chemical fuel that it can draw off of to make ATP. And without the mitochondria, the products of photosynthesis are not in a usable form of energy that the plant can make use of. An example that can be used to put this material on a broader scope would be introducing clean energy production. So using these specific mechanisms and processes of the chloroplast and mitochondrial function and relating those to the use of microalgae, harvesting of microalgae for clean green energy. This can also bring in some connections to outside fields such as engineering, biotechnology, sustainability, that can make this content a little bit more relatable for certain students. On that note, providing this article here, Mitochondria and Chloroplast Function in Microalgae Energy Production, can be a good supplemental reading of research that takes this course material, this concepts, and makes it applicable to an outside field that's outside of the biology classroom. The Algae for Energy experiment is a way to bring those concepts into the classroom in a hands-on experiment. The experiment entails having students cultivate algae in bottles to study biofuel production and photosynthesis. They can measure light impacts on growth and study how the algae consumes and manufactures and releases products. So that experiment kind of takes all of the mechanisms and processes and things that have been learned throughout this course material on the mitochondria and chloroplast function and puts them into a real tangible scenario. An additional supplemental resource that can enhance instruction is the use of 3D models, such as the Visible Body Suite. It offers interactive models and simulations on cycles such as photosynthesis, the whole system of the plant cell, and how these energy conversion cycles are taking place within their respective organelles, so within the chloroplast and within the mitochondria. Resources such as these can add an additional visual element to student comprehension. So these are all the references that I've utilized throughout the presentation. Thank you so much for listening, and if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.